So welcome. My name's Caryn, and my colleague Jeremy. Thanks for joining us for where we'd like to share with you a little bit more about how we did a hiring process at the University of California, Irvine. So my role right now is I'm a learning experience designer in the Paul Merage School of Business. I was formerly the Senior Instructional Technology Specialist in the Office of Information Technology, where I coordinated the support activities.
And, actually, could we get another microphone back up here? Thank you. And I'm Jeremy Thacker. I'm currently the manager of a team called DUE Data and Development. We support the Division of Undergraduate Education at UC Irvine. But in a past life, I worked with Caryn in Academic Web Technologies, the team that maintains the learning management system for UC Irvine. We're also going to introduce you to some more characters who aren't with us today because they didn't fit in our luggage, but they will factor into the presentation. So we'll be talking about team hiring, and these are the other members of our team who you'll see why they're important later. But you will actually hear from Kelsey Leos, who we have in video form. She's supervisor for Academic Web Technologies. And you'll hear from Eric Kelly, who was a candidate who went through this process that we'll be describing when he was joining our team. Other folks who will factor in, we have an associate director who's heavily involved in the team, so she was involved in the hiring process, a user experience architect, a couple of software engineers, of which I was one at the time, and also a couple of support folks. Caryn was a support person at the time. So our team was traditionally a waterfall team for a very long time. We had a very regimented hiring process that we used. It went through several phases like most hiring processes do, and it always culminated in a team interview. That was sort of the last sign-off on any candidate who was going to join our team. That team interview consisted of an hour in a Red Robin format, much like this. I like to think we looked a little friendlier, but it was still about as intimidating. So one at a time, we'd go around and we would ask questions ranging from technical questions to support-oriented questions. We would ask things like, how would you measure the weight of a plane without a scale? So it got kind of interesting.
My favorite question was, how does the internet work?
How does the internet work is always a good one. So whether someone was a technical person or support person, this was always kind of the last phase of their interview process, and so it had been for many, many years. Well, there was a change in September of 2014 when our team moved from Waterfall to Scrum. And along with that transition, we brought in a lot of Agile culture to the team that hadn't been there before, which brings along with it all the trappings like a heavy emphasis on interpersonal communication, cooperation, being deeply integrated with each other in a cross-functional way, and also a general willingness to experiment, try things that are a little bit outside the box, see how it goes, and then modify. So after we'd been doing Agile for about a year and a half, I got an email from the Agile Alliance. It's a great newsletter if you're into Agile stuff. And they were going to be having a webinar about hiring Agile teams. And we thought, well, we do, hiring once in a while, so this might be of interest to us. It was hosted by Mitch Lacey, who's an Agile coach. And we thought it might be worth tuning in. I'm actually going to go ahead and hand off to our supervisor, Kelsey, now, who will talk a little bit more.
So this actually started with a certain gentleman named Jeremy Thacker, who noticed that there was a webinar on hiring for Scrum teams and invited me and some other folks to attend that, since we are in a Scrum team and we were doing some hiring. That helped prompt thinking about what was missing from our hiring process for assessing for an Agile collaborative world, and caused me to say, hey, Jeremy, Caryn, I'd like you to think about how you could improve our hiring process.
Thanks, Kelsey. So a whole bunch of us on the team watched this webinar in our separate offices, like you do. But we all thought it was pretty neat how it talked about really integrating your candidates with the team. Now, the webinar approached it from the perspective of hiring a programmer. And what it said is, bring your candidate in for an entire day and have them pair program with your career programmers and see how they actually work with the people in your team. See how they approach problems. Don't just give them an exercise and stick them in a room for an hour and then have them walk you through it. See how they actually work productively with your team, so you find out not only on a larger span how they approach their work, but also how do they culturally fit with the organization. And we thought, wow, that's really interesting. And we stuck it in our pocket until we had to do hiring in the future. Oops. We stuck.
So we made a case. We were in the midst of a transition of our learning management system. We were going from a homegrown learning management system to a vendor-provided Instructure Canvas system. So we made a case based on the support interactions that we had that we needed some more support folks. We needed some people to help us man the desks, man the phone, and answer questions. So we got approval to hire 2 new technology support specialists. So yay, exciting, right? Now we get to start the hiring process. We had approval for 2 temporary positions. We had guaranteed funding for 2 years. And of course, whenever you're in that position, you're thinking, we want to bring in somebody who's really good, somebody who can get the ground running, somebody who knows a little bit about the systems that we're using, and somebody who can impress management so much that we say after 2 years, there's no way we can let them go. So we were really trying to craft a position and a recruitment in a way that we found a really good candidate.
So we started, as you often do, by crafting a job description. And typically what we do for that is we'd look at the last job description for a similar job and copy and paste and make a couple of changes and be done. Well, this was a position unlike we'd really had before. Certainly we'd had support people before, but usually they do like support and quality assurance, or they do support and instructional design. But it was generally a much larger, more vague, less focused job. And this was for something very specific, helping people to move from one LMS platform to another. And we needed people with specific knowledge in that area and with really specific skills to be able to support people over email, in person, all sorts of different ways, but for this very, very specific role. So we thought, well, we don't really know what the job description looks like for this. In fact, we've never done a transition like this. We're not sure what the actual work they'll need to do is. So we took a step back and we said, well, if we don't know, necessarily what the tasks will be, do we at least understand what the skills that we need are? So we had done an activity called Lominger competency cards before, which is actually a corporate career guidance and development tool where you get all these cards and they focus on different skills, different competencies, and you do a little sort activity and you figure out what you're good at, where you need improvement, and it helps guide you in terms of figuring out where you can actually improve yourself to further your career. And we thought, well, we have this listing of all these different competencies that apply to lots of things. What if we did a sort for this position that we're developing? So we pulled out our stack of cards and we went through as a group, Caryn, myself, and our supervisor, Kelsey, and we started to say, do we think this skill will be needed for this job? And as we did, we had a lot of really stimulating conversation about what actual tasks this person would likely need to do. And at the other end, what we ended up with was a list of actually functional things they'd need to do because those came out through conversation, and it was really complete, more so than if we just sat down and started throwing ideas at the wall. But in addition, a list of skills, an actual skill set, not just what they need to do, but what sorts of proficiencies they would need to have to do the job.
All right, so now we're at the point where we can actually start designing an interview.
Let's see.
So our interview process, clearly we've got a legacy of hiring, right? We've done this a bunch of different times. So I'm going to walk you through each of the different steps just so you can kind of get a full overview of how our team did the hiring, both for this position and for others. So the first step in the process is, of course, an application. Somebody who's interested in the position finds the posting online, goes and answers the standard set of questions with, of course, some supplementary questions that are pertinent to the position and to the role that we were looking to hire. Once they had filled out the application, the hiring manager, Kelsey, and myself took a look at all of the documents that folks had submitted, and we started to kind of look through and say, we want to hear more from this one, maybe not so much that one. And we started that initial triage. There was a large number of applications. I don't have the number on me at the moment. We whittled it down to a semi-large number. And from that, the next step was to actually have somebody who works as a recruiter for OIT at UCI call the candidates and have a very quick initial phone screen. The point of the phone screen was a couple of different things. The first is we were hiring a temporary position. And as you guys well know, not everybody understands the implications of that temporary position. So one of the things that we asked our recruiter to do right up front was make sure that that's clear, that they understand what they're coming in for, that they understand the role of the position, and how we have guaranteed funding for a limited period of time. The second was to kind of see what their skill level was in relation to our position. Now, the recruiter knew a lot about our team, but she didn't know all the ins and outs of who we were and how we wanted to hire. So we didn't put a lot of the onus of figuring out whether this person has the right support skill set and whether they would fit with our team on her. It was a very high level check at that point.
I got trigger happy and pulled out the phone early. Sorry.
So the next step was for Kelsey and I to figure out a little bit more tailored to this position. So we had a phone interview with the candidate. There was a specific set of questions that we took copious notes as we were asking them questions. The questions were definitely more tailored both to our team and to the position. So things about how have you dealt with changing technology? How do you deal with faculty versus students versus TAs? Things like this. The next step after the phone interview, but wait, there's more, was a hiring committee interview. The hiring committee was comprised of folks outside of our group. So Kelsey and I were on this hiring committee, but we also had some people from across campus who were familiar with what we did and how we do it. This was really invaluable for us because it helped us to have kind of an outsider's perspective. Somebody who was going to be a client that the support person was going to work with was able to look at what the support person did and how they communicated and give us feedback on that. So that was extremely helpful. Now we get to the team interview, which we're talking about today. So notice they've gone all the way through all this process before they even get to talking to our team. By this point, we've invested some time and energy in these folks, and we're thinking there's a possibility that they might be a good fit. So this is not something that you want to do early in the process. You want to kind of whittle things down so that you make sure that you're spending your team's time and energy on the candidates that have a good chance of getting through this interview. And then, of course, the last step is the hiring process. And what you'll see here from here is directly from the candidate.
My interview process was punctuated by conversations with a recruiter who would let me know that I had moved on to the process, or presumably if I hadn't, she would have told me that instead. And then sort of a setup for what the next piece of the process was. So we moved from a simple phone interview with 2 folks onto a panel interview with more, and then I'd get the information on how many more. This one was different because I get the sense that the recruiter wasn't certain exactly how this was going to look. I went back and looked up and found the exact words that I was told were that this was possibly going to be a clumsy team interview. That's how it was put to me, which didn't give me a lot to go off of. But looking back, I have a feeling that the clumsiness part might have been based on the remoteness, just because that is something that's tricky to do. And I don't know if it was the first time when I was actually doing it. So.
2 quick comments. When Jeremy and I heard that our recruiter said it was potentially a clumsy interview, we both went like this. So just kind of something to be aware of. The second piece of information on this, when he was our candidate, he was actually living out of state. So he was interviewing completely remotely.
So onto the clumsy team interview. So we'd been thinking about how we want to approach our next round of sort of team interviewing with this idea that it should be more collaborative and more representative of the actual work that one would do on the team. And in the webinar that we watched, it was about programming. Easy enough, sit a programmer down with a programmer and they'll work. This is a support person. We're not going to ask them to respond to specific support requests from people on our systems that they know nothing about. So we had to figure out, okay, how might we tackle this? And it was actually Kelsey who took the initiative to kind of start that process. I'll go ahead and let her explain that to you.
There are things that a round robin interview does not reveal well, or does not typically reveal well, such as how a person collaboratively works with others. That's the chief thing. How do they think on their feet when it's not, just a brief interview question, but it's really a problem that they actually have to solve. We have ways to assess that in different positions. So for programming positions, for example, we will give some kind of a programming exercise and actually see the candidate do some work. But for support positions, we weren't really doing that. We tried certain sort of practical exercises, but they were little snippets of work. They might let us see how someone wrote a support response, like their command of that language and tone, but they didn't show us how they would collaborate. And we're a highly collaborative team. We need to move pretty quickly when we're working through problems. And we were missing, especially the dynamic between a support person and a programmer. Could that support person come to a programmer with the information the programmer needs to help investigate a problem? Can they take the information back from a programmer and interpret it and ask intelligent questions about it? We were really missing that component of that interactive behavior, which is so much a part of what we're doing every day and such a critical part of a person's competency in that role.
So we thought, if we could test a programmer by having them sit and do programming work, we can't actually give a support person, an actual support request because they won't have the knowledge necessary. But what if we could make something like a support request that basically anyone with the general skill set, based on those skills that we talked about before, could approach and could work with the team on the same way that a support person might, and then could ultimately correspond back to the client. And we could get a sense for how do they communicate with a client? How do they approach a problem? What's their general breadth of knowledge around technical support? So we thought we might actually build a representative, I need to figure out how to click, there we go, a representative sample of this that we called a day in the life of a support person. So we kind of started to put together a general template for what this might look like. We realized that it would need to be something that is general enough that someone who's new to the team could understand. They wouldn't have to have deep knowledge about UC Irvine and our learning management system to be able to, make it through this exercise. But at the same time, it had to be specific enough that it's actually relevant to what we do day to day. And we also wanted to be absolutely sure that this person would end up interacting with all of the functional groups in the team by the time they were done, because the reality is that anyone who works support in our team ends up doing that. They have to be able to work smoothly with technical folks. They need to be able to talk to our associate director about potential solutions to problems that recur, things like that. So what we imagined was one of our most common cases is a support workflow where they'll get an email in, they'll have to assess a problem, maybe do a little bit of vetting with the team and figure out what was happening, and then give a meaningful response back to the client. So sort of an end-to-end test of that skill set. And along the way, they would have to meet with all the different parts of our team and kind of communicate with them around this. In order to facilitate that, we figured out that we'd probably also need to make some assets. So realistic looking things like a sample email to be the email that they receive, sample server logs that a programmer might give to them. But all these things kind of watered down so that they could be easily digestible and not too specific, so that they weren't too particular to UCI and kind of the nuances of how we do our business. And then lastly, to get the entire team on board with this crazy idea, we would have to create a script. So people knew generally what to expect when someone was coming in, what they would have experienced before, what their role was in interacting with the candidate, and would be able to help the candidate get from point A to point B. The end result looked something like this. So we have our candidate, Eric, although plug in any candidate for every time that we did this. And they would start out with our supervisor, Kelsey, who would give them a briefing. We thought it's not fair to just throw someone into this because this is insane. This is not a normal interview. We wouldn't want someone to suddenly be going through this simulation without knowing it was coming. So we made sure that they would have an opportunity to be warned, actually by the recruiter, that we're going to have an unusual interview process. They'd sit down with Kelsey, who would explain to them what's about to happen, let them know that they're welcome to ask questions, that this is meant to be cooperative. They're not expected to have all the answers. It's really about how they interact with the group and work through problems. From there, they would go to the support team, where they would receive an email support issue and kind of talk through initial steps and thinking with our actual support staff. You'll notice Kelsey is still with them. We decided that she should stay with them like a Sherpa, sort of a source of comfort, someone they're already familiar with, and someone who could help to overcome any hiccups along the way, because one team's not necessarily sure of what another sub-team might have, interacted with them around. After that, they would meet with our developers, who would collect information about the issue from the candidate based on their analysis of the email, and then would answer any questions that they have about the technical particulars of the issue that happened, hopefully leaving there with information about technically what might have gone wrong. They'd then go and speak to our business analysis folks, explain the issue, talk about maybe things that we could do in the future to not have this issue, see if they have good ideas around how to avoid common pitfalls and things like that. And then lastly, return to the support folks to draft an email response and we get a sense of their writing ability and how they basically approach in terms of tone, that kind of thing. Along the way, we had checkpoints that we called them. So in between each, we made sure that every candidate left that session with all the information that they needed in order to be potentially successful in the next. Because we didn't think that it's fair that if someone tripped in the support section and didn't get what they needed out of that email, that they might have, ruined the entire rest of the interview. So we'd get to the end of a session, we'd say, okay, this is how far we got. Also, here's important information that you need to know, so that every candidate would go into each session more or less fresh and have an opportunity to recover. To talk about it from the first person, here's Eric.
have insight into what we're looking for. There's a document, as I referred to before, that talks about each step of the process, what the key outputs are from that process, things we're looking for the applicant to get out of it. Then there are resets. So if the applicant seems not to be reaching, they have 5 minutes with the first group to reach a certain ending state where they have certain screenshots. So in this example, if they haven't asked for the screenshots, we kind of need to give them to them because they're essential for the future parts of the process. So one of the things that I've learned in participating is how well thought out and how meticulous the planning is for this. As the applicant, I got some sense of that because these screenshots didn't just come out of nowhere. So I could tell that this was part of a process. But there's a whole back end that the applicant doesn't ever see that really helps participants drop into this process and work with an applicant. That's definitely really nice.
So anytime that someone in a video says something complimentary about how we organized this, I just like to say we did not feed them any lines or anything like that.
Cue cards, insert compliment here.
But you will see some of those sample assets that we created, things like screenshots and all that in just a moment. But at this point, it's probably becoming clear that one of the things about this process is it was a lot of work up front to get all these moving parts in order and to get the whole team on board. We'll talk about that some more, but hopefully it's starting to emerge through some of these comments. Here's Kelsey on the importance of having a Sherpa.
So first I'll say I highly recommend having someone in this position who is walking the candidate, room to room, or in the case of a virtual interview, is sitting at the camera the whole time and bringing sub-teams in. I think it's quite valuable. I get to see things like if the candidate goes down the wrong path early on with one sub-team and then in subsequent rounds gets information that's trying to pull them back onto the right path, do they get that? Do they see it? Do they pick up on it? I get to see how once they've gotten information in one round and they go into the next and they're telling people, okay, this is what I've learned so far, I get to see not only whether they're understanding what they've heard, but also whether they're packaging it in an effective way for the next group of people. So I really get to see that evolve. I get to see how they correct themselves. If they do get something a little wrong and then correct it, I get to watch that happen, and I can see how they handle that personally. If they go, oh, I learned something really useful here, and smoothly move on, or if they kind of get stubborn and cling to an idea even though it's getting countered a bit. I also get to see how much prompting they need, how much of what they get to at the end came from them genuinely versus had to be steered. So I find that extremely valuable. Again, I also think about the candidate. And I think there's some reassurance for them in having a consistent presence who's there throughout. I'm keeping track of time, so no one else has to. I'm able to, make little pushes, little nudges and directions that I feel are necessary to get the information that we need. So it's really useful, and it is a really valuable perspective. It's fascinating.
So in the creation of this scenario, we basically put together a short support story that the candidate would be traveling through and sort of unraveling as they go. At this point, we'll actually take you into that story and show you some of the particular assets that we created to support it and how it played out for the candidate.
All right, so this is how it all started. Single piece of paper. The candidate gets something like this. This is a pretty typical support request that somebody on our team would have received. We built in little Easter eggs because you got to have personality, right? So there's a couple typos in there. There's the plea for this is really, really, really important, right? It's critical to my grade. Not only was that part of the story, but it helped us to see how the candidate responded to that. Was the response like, student's fine, or was it like, well, let's see what happened, right? That's very telling, and it's something that you couldn't determine if you just asked them, how do you approach a student when they submit something like this in an email, right? Because you see their facial expressions, you see their reactions. The other thing that we included was some metadata that we get for all of our support interactions. In some respects, this was a little bit deeper than what the candidate really needed to answer the question, but it did give them a feel for the types of information that we would have. It gave them information about were they logged in and what kind of a browser were they using. So this seems pretty simple, right? But there's more. So the email is really only the first asset. Can you click? Yeah. So ideally, when the candidate sees that email, they're going to say, well, what does the discussion board look like, right? Not necessarily having any prior knowledge of our system or any knowledge of any specific discussion boards. That is probably going to be a question that any person who has the skills to do support is going to ask. Is it actually there? Is there actually a problem? Can I verify it? And the second question, if once they've gotten through that, is probably, well, how did the student get this post onto the board? Okay, so you can see we're starting to develop that story a little bit more. And again, these are somewhat low fidelity mock-ups. There's no logos, there's nothing specific to EEE or Canvas or anything else. The focus of this was really on troubleshooting and how the candidate worked through the problem. It wasn't on finding an answer on our specific kind of discussion board. It was really, what's their way of thinking? How are they going to work through this problem? How are they going to try to solve it?
So we would certainly try to steer them towards these things as need be, giving the candidate opportunity to ask for it proactively. But what was interesting is it gave us a sense for their intuition about what kinds of things they should be looking for. And we find that people who had a lot of experience or just natural ability to do these things would kind of find their own way through the simulation without needing very much prompting. It was pretty cool. So after meeting with the support folks, they'd move on to the programmer team, which as a programmer I'd think would be one of the scarier parts. Not everyone had a lot of experience working with programmers, so we were particularly helpful in trying to steer people along. And not a big deal if people didn't know initially what to ask for, but rather it's could they digest the information that they gave them, and even if we handed them the solution, would they understand what had gone wrong? So this is a mock log that we created. It's actually a simplified version of the real logs that we frequently use. So it's not uncommon for a support person to come to us. We'll spit out a set of logs, hand it to them, and depending on bandwidth and what the issue is, sometimes we'll say, oh, here's the issue. Other times they'll actually review the logs as support folks and see if they can find the issue. I went ahead and highlight the important part. Which is these 3 logs that are pretty telling, where the candidate gets, or where the user got to view, create, reply, the view, create, reply event in our message board twice in a row, which isn't possible via the interface. Now, we don't expect the candidate to figure that out right away, but all of the crumbs are there. So by viewing the interface and the navigation that we gave them already, you can tell that. Going to 2 creates in a row just in general application flow is unusual. I'd say 90% of the time we actually basically walked the candidate through, this is unusual and this is why it's unusual. And then we'd ask, what do you have an idea of what might cause something like that? And the people who had a lot of experience with support or a lot of technical, background would be like, oh, that might happen if you had 2 browsers open or 2 browser tabs open, which in our mock scenario is exactly what happened. Not that there are any true right answers. But this is the sort of thing that we'd see in the real world. Programmers would look through the logs, and whenever we see a double event like that that's not possible through navigation, oh, well, they had 2 browser tabs open. So eventually we'd explain that to candidates, and they had varying degrees of success in even understanding it once it had been directly explained to them. We had a couple of additional assets just to make things a little bit more concrete. We'd also give them what we were calling a extraction from our database that was the information relevant to the post that was created. And then we gave them a screenshot from a different post. So essentially what happened in our story was the user had these 2 tabs open, they typed out their response, they hit submit, but they submitted it to the wrong message board. So you have this completely unrelated post to do with superhero outfits inside of a message board about Charles de Gaulle. And again, we would hope that the candidate looking at this would say, oh, that seems out of place, and start to piece together in their head what had happened. Another detail, we would ask them for any information that they had about the post so that we could get information for them from the database. One of the little nuggets that we left was the IDs and the URLs. And again, people who had a lot of experience around this kind of stuff would kind of know that. Of course, if someone didn't know that, it wasn't a big deal, but we'd hope that they'd understand it once we explained it to them.
It was also interesting to see how they responded when they didn't know to ask for that. Was it like, well, that's stupid? Or was it like, oh, kind of a thing? So clearly, that's the candidate's perspective, but we needed our team to be prepared as well. So these are some of the things we pulled together for our team. So on the left-hand side here, you see the top sheet that we gave to all of our team members. It has things like an agenda. What will the candidate have done before they get to your desk? What will they have seen? Who will they have talked to? It also had right up front the goal. Again, coming from kind of a Scrum team, we were very focused on what are we trying to accomplish. We always put that goal right up front, not looking for more or less. We were really looking to accomplish that. And we wanted to make sure that that was kind of fresh in our team's brain, so that as they were looking at candidates, as they were interacting with folks, that was reinforced in many different times. And note also, this is kind of the high level. There was significant detail for each individual piece. So for every group, for every functional area that met with the candidate, we had a goal for their time. We had information about who was going to be in the room. We had what the candidate was going to get at the beginning of the time. We had what we were really looking for them to come up with. These were the ideal responses. If a candidate exhibited these, asked these questions, or said these things, we were like, all right, you're nailing it, right, in our brains. So those were, we sat down and figured out what would we really want a really strong candidate to be able to do or know. And then we also had those resets. So those are things that we wanted to be sure by the end of their time with a group that they had all of those things. Now, I will tell you up front, this can be tricky because you don't want to get to the end of your time with the candidate and go, oh, you kind of screwed up, you didn't get everything, so let me give you what you actually needed to get. These are the questions you should have asked, this is what you should have gotten, right? Because at that point then you're kind of making the candidate feel about this tall, right? And it's no longer a collaborative process, it's you really evaluating the candidate, where if you know in the back of your head, okay, by the end of the time with us, they're going to need screenshots and knowledge about how they verified the issue, you can build that in to your conversations. And you really want your team to be prepared for that. And you also want to know, excuse me, what the output is. This is what you want to get the candidate to by the end of your time with them. Remember, this was 5 minutes. Okay, so this was all the stuff we wanted to accomplish in 5 minutes with this candidate in their first time set. So those were kind of the details for each individual section, but we also wanted to be able to document our team's perspectives. There were two big things that we pulled together. The first one is this rubric. We're an instructional technology team, so rubrics are kind of natural for us. We know when we're evaluating things and looking at submissions to kind of have a set of criteria that you're looking to evaluate somebody on. And notice, these are all those competencies. So we went back to those competencies that we identified in the card sorting exercise. These are the skills that we want the candidate to have. And also notice, the rating is very simple. -1, 0, or 1. Scale of 1 to 5 was too much to handle when we had all this other stuff going on, right? Did they nail it? Did they fail it? Or were they just about average? That was all we wanted them to be evaluated on at that point. We also gave our team room for notes and encouraged our team to jot down stuff that occurred to them as they were working with the candidates. Our team is known as copious note takers in interviews. So this was very cultural for us. And it was also something that helped us later as we were thinking through what we had experienced with the candidate. Now, at this point, you're kind of thinking, okay, you've gone through the competencies a bazillion times, but not everybody on our team had. So we wanted to make sure that we were all evaluating on the same criteria, that we were level setting. So in addition to space for notes, we provided the definition for the competencies. This is what written communication means. This is what time management means. So that when our team went to say how the candidate did on each of those, we were all thinking along the same lines, and there wasn't programmer weirdness brain or something like that. Absolutely. Yes and no. We were looking for how a candidate responded to the situation, less than what information they got. If we found that a candidate, and I'll speak to the support perspective just because that was kind of where I was coming from. If we found that a candidate didn't ask any questions, had no curiosity about the situation, and really wasn't even aware of what was happening, we would have dinged them. If we would have interacted with a candidate and they had some questions, maybe they were going along the wrong path, but they were inquisitive about it and they were kind of thinking along the lines that we wanted them to think about, and we still had to reset them, I wouldn't have dinged them because they had the competencies.
Yeah, it helps that we focused on competencies and skills rather than actual, check boxes in terms of, oh, did they do the specific thing we're looking for? Because what you ended up doing was taking the whole of your interaction and then applying it against these sorts of general skills, levels of understanding, amount of inquisitiveness, things like that.
Yeah, and I can also, just one other follow-up, I can say that there were some candidates that nailed the question that got low ratings because of how they interacted with our team or how they interacted with the exercise. So it was not at all about correct and incorrect. Good question, though. Okay. All right, so we did a dress rehearsal because we had that first question. Right, I mean, clearly at this point we've invested a lot in this, and it's kind of like, is this going to work? What is somebody going to do when they are put in this situation? So we had a colleague, Kim Gerard, who is awesome. She also does tech support for a technology system, and she's also well-versed in instructional technology. So we said, Kim, can you give us half an hour and just let us talk at you for a few minutes? So we exposed her to everything that we had pulled together from the candidate's perspective, not from the team's perspective. And we said, how would you respond to this? What would you think about our team? What are some of the directions you would go? Give us some feedback and kind of talk us through it. That was incredibly valuable because it helped us in many ways strengthen our resets and strengthen what we as a team were looking for. Because up until this point, Jeremy and I mean, we're brilliant and all, but we were looking at this from our perspective. We needed somebody from outside to take a look at this. So it was very helpful in us kind of crafting what we were putting together and seeing somebody who had some expertise, but not necessarily specialized expertise in our area.
And definitely a good thing for us was that Kim, who we think is a great support person, went through this exercise and absolutely nailed it and did all the things we were really hoping that a great candidate would do, which was deeply reassuring to us because we thought, okay, we're not completely insane, just a little unhinged.
Yeah. The other thing that we did, because we were working in a team environment, right? We prepared our team. I will tell you, one of the most awkward things I think that Jeremy and I did in our time with this interview was we actually mocked through this interview. So Jeremy or I played the role of the candidate, and we sat down with each of the functional areas, and we asked sometimes silly questions, sometimes difficult questions. We wanted to prepare our team for what a typical candidate might come at them with. It did a couple different things. It prepared our team to know some of the questions that were going to come out, and it also helped it not feel so awkward, right? It was okay that it was awkward with Jeremy and I because, well, we were part of the reason that it was awkward. But we were testing this system, and we wanted our team to be comfortable so that when that candidate was sitting in their office, sitting in their room, they weren't thinking about, okay, this is weird. I don't understand why we're doing this, and this just feels really strange. What do I do now? They were getting into the story. They were getting into that simulation. They were talking with the candidate. They were interacting with them. So it is incredibly useful both to validate what you've pulled together and to help prepare your team.
So with all that prep behind us, we went ahead and we actually did the interview. We did about a half dozen of them. From that half dozen candidates, we hired 2 candidates. In each case, we went through our rubrics and, marked everybody's scores. We had discussions afterward about the general vibe that we got from the candidate. We were able to use the concrete scores based on skills to figure out whether we felt like they were a good fit for our team. And one thing that's really cool is one of the candidates who we ultimately hired was a candidate who didn't have a lot of directly relevant technical support experience on paper. But they came in and they nailed the interview. And everybody was completely impressed with their intuition for how to approach this, despite not having the kind of practical experience that folks who were already on the team had with it. And ultimately, that person ended up being an outstanding employee that absolutely held through. And they continued. In fact, it's Eric. You've met him. So that worked out quite well. So we have very little time left, and I want to make sure that you get to hear from Eric and Kelsey some more. So we'll fly through this a bit and hopefully have time for a couple questions. But all said and done, we'd like to look at some pros and cons from different perspectives, because we don't think that this is for everyone or that this is necessarily a great idea across the board. It's something interesting that we tried, and we're really here to advocate for thinking outside the box about the way that you interview. If you want to borrow this idea, great, but consider the pros and cons and, innovate further, try different things, all of that. So as far as this particular process goes, this simulation-based approach to hiring for the candidate, we found that it actually works quite well remotely, which we worried about. We interviewed a couple of people remotely, including Eric, and it went very smoothly. You just need to make sure that you have the ability to transfer files using whatever, remote video app you're using. We found that for the candidate, it actually provides them with a lot of insight into what our team actually does. When you have a round-robin interview and people are asking questions, you get to kind of tell how the team thinks, but you don't really get a sense of what the job is beyond what's in the JD. They got to literally see what this job is, what you will actually be doing, and the kinds of problems that you'll be facing. In terms of cons, it's definitely harder for the candidate to prepare for and to wrap their minds around in advance, which certainly leads to some stress. We did our best to try to create a warm, welcoming environment and to be easygoing and fun through the process, which is kind of part of our team's culture. But despite that, interviewing is a stressful period, and when it's something unusual like this, it can be that much more so.
Clumsy is the word.
There's a lot of pressure in this team interview. You can tell a candidate that we're here to help you and that questions are good. And then you can see if they react as though we're here to help. And you can see if they ask questions. You know as well as I do that, having been through this process several times, if there are candidates who are told questions are good, but then sometimes they just stay quiet when it seems like they were confused and they could have simply asked a question, that is a point of concern for us.
Right.
From the opposite perspective, that of the team and our supervisor, as far as pros go, we thought that it got well beyond the standard interview questions in terms of our ability to understand the candidate, what their skills were like, how they would actually interact with the team in practice, how they approach problems. And we really enjoyed using a skills-oriented approach to kind of evaluating the candidate, getting outside of the real particulars of exactly what they said in each case, but focusing more on, do they have the kinds of skills that we need for this person to do well in this role? On the other hand, as you've probably seen, this required a lot of work to set up. And we also found that not every member of the team was equally enthusiastic about approaching this. Like I said, our team likes to experiment and try things, so they were all definitely game, but the comfort level varied quite a bit. We were lucky in that in each of our functional subgroups, there was at least one person who was really comfortable with the whole premise and was able to really go through it. But if we had a subgroup where no one was really comfortable with it, that could have been problematic.
I think it got us information we were missing before. I think it gives the candidate information that they were missing before. They get to get a much clearer idea of what it's like to work in this team, and in some ways, the intensity of that. One of the really interesting things that we discovered was some of the candidates enjoyed the process a lot, and some of them did not. And that actually seemed to us to be a good indicator of whether they would enjoy working in a team that has this much collaborative interaction and thinking and working on the fly. So pros, we were getting information we were missing before, and so was the candidate. It was also kind of fun.
So yeah, at the end of each interview, we'd get responses from the candidates that ranged from, wow, that was really cool and stimulating, to that was really weird. And certainly what we weren't looking for was for them to like the process. It wasn't that in itself, oh, well, they didn't like our process, we're not going to hire them. But rather, that's really reflective of how our team works and how we approach problems and how we do things. So if they're uncomfortable with the way that, this whole thing was organized, these are the kinds of things they're going to have to do as a career, member of the team, not just the work itself, but the way that we've organized this whole event. So in a way, it reflects cultural fit. Whoops, what'd I do? Oh, well, I ended up in the right place anyway. Though not in presentation mode. Well, we're going to roll with it because we're short on time, but here's some more final words.
There are distinct moments, and it's when you're the applicant, it's like your wedding day. It just goes by like that, and you struggle to remember the little pieces that you want to recall later. But I remember very specific moments where I can remember now that the people that I was interviewing with displayed some kind of personality trait that I still see in them today. That may be something that you don't get in a normal interview process. And I don't know how that comes out, how that relates to this particular process. But I think if people are simulating the job that they do, then they may simulate how they are in that job a little more than they would than if you were just facing them across the table. And so that's really important. And I think I did come out of that team interview process with more of a feeling like I want to be a part of this team, because now I've seen what the team is and how they are. So yeah, there's not a great anecdote where I can say this person said this and that's how I knew, but I came out of the process feeling much better about my application and about the prospects of joining the team than I had before.
That's really what you're looking for a candidate to say coming out of this interview. I like the team. I like what I would get to do.
And at this point, we are over on time. I want to make sure that we respect the next presentation. So I will just paraphrase Kelsey's last bit. They are still using this process. There was just a new round of hiring. Caryn and I are no longer on the team, but they used the same approach and have continued to have success with it. So for this particular team, it's been a really good thing. But and I can't seem to advance, but basically the big summary, I think, for us is to be willing to think outside the box, try new things, experiment, and really see if the fit of your candidate is a skill fit and a cultural fit with your organization by really walking them through what they really need to be able to do.
Yeah?
Did you get much resistance from like your central HR? I was going to phrase that as how many pounds of Xanax you got from your central HR? How to let you do this?
We had a bunch of support. So we were really, we kind of explained to them, this is what we're looking to do. It's a simulation. And they said, okay, you guys know what you're going to hire best. So, yes, definitely. They were fantastic.
You said the whole exercise was 5 minutes long?
No, sorry. The first part with the support team was 5 minutes long. The whole exercise itself took 90 minutes. So that was them moving from space to space and then having a round robin interview at the end. We had initially bandied about having a whole day interview, and we went, no, that's just me.
I had the same question as him about HR, what central HR said about it.
Yeah, our at UCI OIT HR is really looking to make sure that we hire people that fit our roles and our teams, and that have the potential to be long-timers. So we had significant amount of support from HR.
Actually, in the front-ish and then in the back.
Yeah. Okay, so how long did the entire process take from the very first step to the simulation?
Are you talking just the simulation or the whole time with the candidate?
The whole thing, just since, like usually with recruitment, managers want to hire, so I'm just wondering how long that process is.
It took us a couple months. Yeah. We really did a lot of refining of selection of candidates throughout the whole process. And then we were doing team interviews for a couple weeks, because this is a fair amount of time for our team, so we had to make sure that everybody had the time on their calendar. So just the logistics of calendars were challenging.
What, if any, considerations did you have for accessibility, like if someone needed screen readers or any other type of considerations?
Yeah, fantastic question. So just to repeat, I should have been repeating all along, what kinds of accommodations do we have for accessibility? Again, we worked with our HR person to make sure that if we needed to have those accommodations that we knew up front. We actually didn't have any scenarios where somebody asked us for those kinds of pieces, but we were very cognizant of the fact that that might come, and we were ready to adjust, definitely. We've actually got to go, but Jeremy and I will be around. You're welcome to either email us or find us, and we're happy to answer questions.
Thank you.